to save the capital. But for 3 days the fire burnt, eventually destroying 13,000 houses, over 80 churches, 44 company halls, and the old St. Paul's Cathedral. There were surprisingly few recorded deaths, though many of the anonymous poor were probably cremated in their homes. But 5/6 of the area within the city walls was destroyed. It was a calamity without equal. Central London was reduced to a pile of smouldering ashes. And the baker from Pudding Lane said, all right, you don't have to go on about it." In fact, such a catastrophe demanded a more meaningful scapegoat than a common house fire, fanned by a strong wind in a dry summer. Rumours spread that the fire had been deliberately started by Jesuits, by the Dutch, by Spaniards. In fact, a Frenchman was virtually dismembered by a London mob, while the King's Guard took it upon themselves to start attacking people who spoke poor English. Eventually, a French watchmaker, Robert Hubert, confessed to starting the fire, though it became clear during his trial that his story was nonsense. The King's chief minister commented,
"Neither the judges nor any present at the trial did believe him guilty, but that he was a poor, distracted wretch, weary of his life, and chose to part with it."
He was publicly hanged at Tyburn, and even though he was a Protestant, an official plaque was later put on the monument to the fire, blaming the Popish faction for the inferno, where it remained until 1831, soon to be replaced with a plaque blaming Muslim extremists. But it is important to understand that England's growing anti-Catholicism over the 17th century wasn't just about sectarian religious bigotry. Catholicism was equated with the totalitarian monarchies of France and Spain. The existence of Parliament and the relative liberties enjoyed by Englishmen were seen as the product of a Protestant society. This issue finally came to a head at the climax of the century, with the accession of England's last Catholic monarch, James II, in 1685. The so-called Popish faction, who had tried to blow up Parliament and apparently burned down the whole of London, now had their own man on the throne. Within 3 years, he would be driven from the country, as the Protestant champion of Europe, William of Orange, landed in England to take the crown, forming a unique contract between monarch and the now supreme Parliament that had no equivalent anywhere in the world. On the day he and his army arrived in Torbay, the bonfires were already burning across the country. He had landed on November the 5th.
Episode 2. The Vikings.
Or how wave after wave of immigration made and continues to make Britain the rich, fascinating and occasionally suspicious country it is today.
It must have been hard being a liberal in the 5th century. You tried to talk in encouraging terms about all the positive aspects of multiculturalism, about the wonderful rainbow mix of ethnic traditions and customs, and then all the immigrants let you down by splitting everyone's head open with an axe, forcing you and your family to flee for your lives.
Yes, well, you see, in their religion, murder and pillage is very much a matter of honour. So I think it would be rather culturally elitist of us to attempt some sort of universal moral judgment based on our own ethical... Oi! The bastard! He just nicked my ox.
In the year 789, some strange visitors turned up off the coast of Dorset and killed the local reeve. His village was left with no one to do all the reeving. The account of this first Viking raid appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the official record of events in late Anglo-Saxon England. Soon, readers of the Chronicle got fed up with reading the same depressing news year after year.
Vikings raid Lindisfarne.
Jarrow Monastery burned by Viking thugs.
Iona monks murdered by Vikings.
Stop this Viking misery, says the Chronicle.
What was so terrifying about the Vikings was not just the suddenness with which they appeared, but also the savagery of their attacks. None of the usual European rules of engagement seemed to apply. King Edmund of East Anglia was tied to a tree and used for target practice by Viking archers. A Northumbrian king had his lungs ripped out of his chest, while another king was apparently hung from a tree by his testicles. At least, that was his excuse when they found him. Of course, our view of the Vikings is coloured by the fact that for centuries our only source material was the Anglo-Saxon accounts of their raids, and so we have tended to stereotype the Vikings by presuming that they were all brutal and thuggish. but you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. The earliest Viking raiders to leave Scandinavia tended to be the sons of farmers who had no land of their own. They were young, they were male, they'd had a few beers. Imagine hundreds of football hooligans going on a booze cruise, armed with swords and axes, and the wanton violence no longer seems so alien. Into this chaos, a young English prince called Alfred was born in Wantage, who was to become the greatest king in Anglo-Saxon history. A demoralised and frightened people did not have much hope that this 22-year-old king would fare better than the leaders of the other Saxon kingdoms. But at every turn, Alfred proved to be creative and determined as he led a fight back that brought hope to the whole of Europe. A grateful pope even sent him a piece of the original cross on which Christ had been crucified.
Footnote: there were quite a lot of pieces of wood from the original cross in circulation at the time. Enough to make a few hundred crosses anyway.
King Alfred sought continental expertise on shipbuilding and constructed a fleet longer and faster than those of the Danes, with the result that he managed to destroy a Viking fleet of 120 ships in the English Channel. The Viking leader Guthrum signed a treaty saying that they would leave Wessex alone, but Alfred's weakness was that he trusted the Vikings not to break their word. The heathens struck at Christmas, with a massive army combining Guthrum's forces with the Vikings who had taken control of South Wales. Alfred was taken completely by surprise and was forced to flee and hide out in the Somerset marshes. Here in disguise, he took refuge in a peasant's hut, where a housewife had told him to watch the cakes while she went to fetch water. So deep in thought was Alfred that he didn't notice the smoke coming from the stove, and when she returned, she scolded him for burning the cakes. He then revealed his identity, and the woman begged for forgiveness, but Alfred was humble and merciful, saying that she had every right to be angry.